Tariff pass-through clauses activating in energy contracts. Pass-through clauses are activating across industrial energy agreements. Procurement teams that accepted broad pass-through language in their energy agreements because it looked like standard contract boilerplate are now receiving invoices that reflect tariff costs they did not model, did not cap, and may have limited ability to dispute. There is a specific kind of budget surprise that arrives not from the energy market itself, but from a clause inside an existing energy agreement. Tariff pass-through provisions, language that gives a supplier the right to recover government-imposed cost increases from the buyer, were drafted into the majority of corporate and industrial energy agreements signed between 2019 and 2023. They were treated as low-probability, standard contract language at the time. The probability is no longer low, and the language is no longer academic. Tariff changes affecting solar panels, inverters, battery storage systems, and other imported components have shifted supplier cost structures in ways that are now being pushed directly to buyers through these provisions. Procurement teams at industrial facilities are dealing with the practical consequences: invoices that exceed contracted rates, disputes over what the pass-through language actually covers, and limited leverage in a renegotiation where the contract language frequently favors the supplier. What triggered the current wave of pass-through activations? The tariff environment affecting clean energy equipment has changed significantly since the period when most industrial energy agreements were executed. Section 201 and Section 301 tariffs on solar components, combined with subsequent modifications affecting inverters, storage systems, and related balance of plant equipment, have increased the landed cost of imported clean energy components for U.S. suppliers. Developers and independent power producers with procurement exposure to these components are invoking pass-through language to recover those costs from their corporate and industrial buyers. The Rhodium Group's 2025 Taking Stock Report and subsequent analyses of the One Big Beautiful Bill, OBBB, estimated that policy-driven changes, including tariff impacts and the loss of clean energy tax credits, could increase total industrial energy expenditures by $7 to $11 billion by 2035 and significantly raise construction costs for utility-scale solar projects. For suppliers managing portfolios of contracted projects, recovering those costs through pass-through provisions is often the difference between a financially viable project and one that requires equity infusion or restructuring. S&P Global Commodity Insights reported that pass-through clause disputes in corporate power purchase agreements, PPA, rose more than 30% year over year in 2025, with industrial buyers representing the largest share of affected agreement types. The disputes are concentrated in agreements signed between 2020 and 2023, which tracks with the period of most active corporate energy procurement activity and, simultaneously, with the period of least rigorous pass-through clause review. How pass-through clause language determines what buyers can do. Not all pass-through clauses work the same way, and the specific language in an agreement determines both the supplier's recovery rights and the buyer's dispute options. The broadest clauses allow suppliers to pass through any cost increase resulting from any government action affecting their cost of supply. That definition is expansive enough to cover not only direct tariffs on components, but also regulatory changes affecting transmission access, interconnection fees, and capacity market charges. Narrower clauses limit recovery to specific tariff categories or require the supplier to demonstrate a direct causal relationship between the tariff change and the cost increase being passed through. Agreements with cost caps on pass-through recoveries give buyers a ceiling on their exposure. Agreements with supplier self-certification provisions, where the supplier can self-report the cost basis for the pass-through, give buyers the least protection and the fewest grounds for dispute. The practical problem for most industrial buyers is that the clause language in their agreements was drafted by supplier counsel and accepted without negotiation during the procurement process. The terms reflect what the market was willing to offer in a period when corporate demand for renewable energy supply outpaced available capacity. Buyers were in a weak negotiating position, and pass-through language was frequently presented as non-negotiable. Industries carrying the most concentrated pass-through exposure. Industrial buyers in manufacturing, chemicals, food processing, and data center operations are carrying the highest concentration of pass-through exposure based on two factors: the volume of long-term energy agreements they executed during the 2020 to 2023 procurement cycle, and the proportion of those agreements tied to suppliers with significant imported component exposure in their generating assets. Manufacturing facilities that signed large volume PPAs to support Scope 2 emissions claims are particularly exposed because the agreements were frequently structured around the renewable energy attributes rather than the economics, which means procurement teams prioritized certificate delivery over contract terms. The financial protections that would have limited pass-through exposure, specifically cost caps and narrow tariff definitions, were negotiated away in favor of volume and attribute certainty. Data center operators present a different profile. The scale of their energy agreements and the reputational stakes of their public clean energy commitments give them more leverage in pass-through disputes than smaller buyers. But the volume of cost exposure is correspondingly larger. A data center operator with 500 megawatts of contracted renewable supply facing a 15% pass-through cost increase is absorbing a materially different dollar amount than a mid-size manufacturer in the same contractual position. What procurement teams can still do about active pass-through claims? The first step is a legal review of the specific clause language in any agreement where the supplier has issued a pass-through invoice or provided notice of intent to do so. The goal is to understand whether the pass-through claim meets the specific requirements of the contract, including documentation requirements, notice timelines, and any cost substantiation obligations the supplier is required to fulfill. Many claims are issued on the assumption that buyers will not challenge them, and a significant percentage do not fully satisfy the contract's own requirements for a valid pass-through recovery. Where the claim is contractually valid, buyers have three practical options. The first is to pay and document the cost as a precedent for future contract negotiations. The second is to negotiate a cap or amendment that limits future pass-through exposure in exchange for accepting the current claim. The third is to explore early termination if the agreement includes provisions that allow exit under material cost change conditions, though most agreements do not make this easy. The longer-term lesson, which procurement teams across industries are absorbing in real time, is that pass-through clause language requires the same legal and financial scrutiny as any other material commercial term. In the next procurement cycle, the question is not whether pass-through provisions belong in energy agreements. It is who bears the cost ceiling and under what conditions. The teams that are negotiating from that position now are in a fundamentally better posture than the ones who accepted boilerplate language and are now managing the consequences. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.